I'm Diane Degnan of United Methodist Communications, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual edition of the Digital Lounge. Changes in technology have opened new doors for digital ministry, and one of those is podcasting. In fact, podcasts are so popular that 28% of the U.S. population listen to podcasts weekly. In recognition of International Podcast Day on September 30th, we are taking this opportunity to talk with some key players in the United Methodist podcasting world, and they are the host of the podcast produced by United Methodist Communications. So hello to everyone on the panel. We've got Crystal Caviness, who is host of Get Your Spirit in Shape, the Reverend Ryan Dunn, who's host of The Compass and pastoring in the Digital Parish, and the Reverend Dan Wunderlich, host of the MyComm podcast. So let's just kick things off with a question for everyone. Who is your podcast for, and what do you hope to bring to your listeners? We'll just go in the same order. So let's start with Crystal.
Well, thank you, Diane, for having me here today. So Get Your Spirit in Shape is a podcast for members of the United Methodist Church. So that is our audience. And our tagline is that we offer spiritual nutrition and exercises to help us keep and get our spirits in shape. So what we hope to bring is conversations that are encouragement, that offer spiritual disciplines, or just offer other information that really will help someone's faith journey.
Thank you, Crystal. How about you, Ryan?
The Compass podcast, the first of the two podcasts I do, is meant for a seeker audience. So we define that as people who are curious about faith, but may not necessarily be engaged in a community of faith yet. And so what we try to do through that is host conversations that help enlighten us to God's movement in our own lives. And that comes through a lot of story sharing. And hopefully through that, then we can begin to witness where God is moving in the world around us as well. And then pastoring in the Digital Parish is for church leaders who are engaged in some form of digital ministry. And it exists really to provide connection and tips and resources for people who are trying to figure out how to build faith communities in digital space.
And you, Dan?
Yeah, so I host the MyComm Church Marketing Podcast, and it is it's a podcast for church communicators. So sometimes that's a communications director, like a staff person at a church. Sometimes it's volunteers, and sometimes it is the pastor who is trying to fit all that in around all of their other responsibilities. And so what we try to do is some episodes are 30,000 foot views, like what is the strategy behind church marketing? And sometimes we dig in deep on techniques, and we go as old school as direct mail. And recently this calendar year, we've had episodes on the metaverse and TikTok. And so we try to span the gamut from online, offline, new, old, whatever tools we can use as church communicators to connect our communities and our churches.
So just to follow up on that, should churches be thinking about doing their own podcast?
Well, Ryan and I actually had that very conversation on our show, as well as Todd Rossnagel, who is the communications director through the Louisiana Conference. So if you want to dig into our archives, November and December of 2021, we actually tackled that topic. And it depends on what your goals are. You can certainly put out your sermons. My church does that. I'm a local church pastor, and we podcast our sermons. It gives our congregation a chance to listen to them again, or a chance to share them. It gives our mobile members or our homebound members another opportunity to receive the teaching. But there are so many other creative ways to do actual ministry and not just capture what's going on in a room and replay it. I'll let Ryan touch on some of those because he was so profound and helpful on our show.
Yeah, I think that podcasting can be a great way of continuing the conversation that we often start on Sunday morning. In ministry, we often bemoan that we only get a certain amount of time to spend with people. And podcasting is a way for us to build relationship kind of asynchronously. So out of just direct time, we can be with people and share thoughts with people whenever it's convenient for them. And so we can use a podcast to, again, build on the conversation that we might have started on a Sunday morning, and we can use that Sunday sermon as a platform then for revealing more about how we are being challenged in our discipleship through the rest of the week, as an example. But yeah, I think it's great for churches to entertain the idea of having a podcast because it just offers that realm of accessibility.
Great. Well, I hope that our audience will check out some of those other episodes. Let me hop over to Crystal and ask you, Crystal, what makes a great conversation when you're talking to people? What really makes you feel like you have really had a good conversation with your guest?
When I really listen to where a person's voice tone changes, where I hear passion, where sometimes I hear emotion. And because we record our podcast, even though it's audio, we do record with the video on. So we are, like in this instance, we're looking at one another. When I see someone visibly get emotional about it, whether that's happy or sad or whatever that might be, I feel like that's a place where we really connect, where a person becomes authentic and vulnerable. And I'm always really honored and humbled when those moments happen, because I realize that they have stepped into a place where they're willing to share with not just me, but with all of our audience. And I feel like that's where the real nuggets happen.
Well, and that's a skill that you have to develop to be able to get people to engage with you in that way. What question for just any of you? What are some important personality traits or strengths or skills that you need to be successful at podcasting?
I would say the most important thing is to understand your audience and what they need. Because if you just want to hit record and record your voice and put it on the internet, you can do that for almost no dollars at all. This is a very cheap thing to get started. And especially if you're a local church that already has a sound system and a microphone, a projection system, you probably have all the tools you need to get started. But if you're not saying what people are willing to give 15, 20 minutes, an hour to listen to, then you're just shouting into oblivion. So the counterintuitive first question is not what do I want to say, but what do the people who are going to listen, what do they want to learn, what do they want to hear, and how do I serve them?
I'll tag on to what Dan said there. This is Ryan, and that there's a patience required for it. I think patience sometimes to keep our own mouths shut, especially if we're doing an interview style podcast where we don't necessarily need to have the gift of gab ourselves to be able to do a good podcast, but we do need to be patient enough to listen to people and then respond to what they're saying, and be patient enough then to put aside what we feel like we need to interject for the audience's sake. So again, it's just building on what Dan said there and really paying attention to what the audience needs more than what we have to say.
Crystal?
I don't have anything to add in addition to that. It's just listening, becoming a good listener. And I think that's just as Ryan said, learning when to not talk is a good skill.
Dan, you mentioned some of the tools that churches may already have, but are there some other like really indispensable tools that you have found that you really like to use?
Yes, actually. So I got into podcasting a few years ago before I started podcasting through United Methodist Communications. I got in kind of right before it blew up and became what it is now. There was certainly a shift. It went from essentially being radio shows. Like I'd been listening to podcasts for a decade, but they were like Car Talk and Wait, Don't Tell Me and This American Life. A lot of them were, NPR shows. And so when sort of Serial came out and that big shift happened, I'd already set up all of my tools, and I have a broadcast quality microphone and I love it and I use it. But if it were to die on me tonight, I would not replace it with a broadcast microphone that a radio station might. There are so many tools that have come available, and I could probably replace my whole setup for less than half of what I paid all those years ago. And two, in the beginning, the tools just for recording an interview, like you can do monologues all you want, and that's great. And some people are really engaging, but what makes Crystal's show great and what makes Ryan's show great is that interview format, that it's not just one person pontificating as some of our episodes are. But it's actually harder to carry on interviews and get those recorded and get them recorded in high quality and in a format that you can edit them properly. But tools have become available. And so the tool that we use on my show, I know Ryan has used some, is called Zencastr, ZENCASTR.com, I believe. And it's an opportunity to record through a web browser. So you don't have to give someone a phone number. They don't have to give you theirs. You don't have to have a Skype account like in the old days. You don't, so sometimes you might seek an interview from someone who's a public figure and they don't want to give you their private information. You can send them a link. And not only does it record each track separately, it records it locally. So if your internet fuzzes in and out, that doesn't get recorded. And it dumps it right into a Dropbox. And then I'm blessed to have a team at UMCom who does the editing for me, which is my favorite part of this job, is that I don't have to do the editing myself. So a tool like Zencastr, I think, is indispensable for capturing things like interviews. But if you have an iPhone, if you've got iPhone headphones or AirPods, you literally have all you need. Even if you just use the voice memo app on your phone, you literally have all you need to get started.
I want to echo that shout out to the production team at United Methodist Communications, who really help us all to do our jobs better. Anyone else got a favorite tool or maybe a tip?
I use a digital audio workstation. That's just a fancy way of saying audio editing software. I think that's really important because it allows me to remove any kind of audio glitches that's going to distract the listener from the content. So I don't go overboard on editing, but it'll let me take out, I don't know, the weird noises that come in the background or mismatched volume levels, which happens from time to time. Anything, again, that's a listener is going to just kind of be a little freaked out by and lose their concentration on what we're saying. So I find that to be really valuable to have. And I use a free program called Audacity. It's pretty simple to use and, of course, free, which is really important.
For Get Your Spirit in Shape, we use a platform called Riverside, and it sounds like it works similarly to Zenmaster, but it really does amp up the quality of the interviews and makes the editing easier. But I've been surprised at what's most indispensable to me are my earbuds, my earbuds. It's like I just have been so surprised at the difference. They're not expensive. They came with my phone, but using them is such a difference between not having them for both me and my guest. So I would say that's kind of that was something that surprised me, that something so small impacted the quality of the podcast in such a tremendous way.
Well, these are all, great insights, but what about the challenges of podcasting? What are some things that you've encountered or that you think that local churches may encounter if they want to start a podcast? And how have you learned, what have you learned that might help people address those? I'll put that out there for whoever wants to jump in.
This is Ryan. I think one of the biggest challenges is connecting with an audience. So a lot of times we start a podcast because we have a pretty clear idea of the things that we're trying to communicate, but those aren't really effective if there's nobody listening to them. And we learn in ministry again and again that nobody turns up just because we start something, right? And so just because our church starts a podcast doesn't mean that people are going to listen to it. We have to figure out a way to present that material to a new audience and then connect with that audience. And I don't know, that's an acute challenge because I don't know if I have an answer for it really on how we do that. I mean, we just try to broadcast in as many places as possible and be present in as many places as possible and let it be known that we do have this podcast and the value that it's offering people. So it's that building that initial audience that is, I mean, a huge challenge and something that, again, goes back to that patience aspect because it takes time.
For me, the biggest challenge is creating a sustainable pace and workflow. For literally the vast majority of podcasts have fewer than 10 episodes. Like if you do the research, people start them and they're way more work than they anticipated and they abandon them, or they start them and see that my mom's the only one listening and they abandon them. Like you have to make a commitment. It's got to be consistent. It's got to be sustainable. And So, I had my own podcast. It was called Art of the Sermon. It's about preaching. I've got 70 episodes still in the archive that you can go and listen to. But when I had my daughter and I had to choose between doing my personal podcast or doing the one for the denomination, I chose the one for the denomination. I only had time to do one. We do one a month, which is a sustainable pace for me. I usually do 2 to 3 at a time, usually within a week. I don't know that my voice can hold up to 2 to 3 in a day, but I'll try to batch them. But if you're a church that's like, we're going to have a deep spiritual conversation, we're going to do a Bible study every week. Well, good luck. Like, if you can do it, that's awesome. Congratulations. But people who ask me for advice now, I tell them, do the season format, come up with 8 to 10 topics, 8 to 10 interviews, record them all as much as you can before you even start releasing them, so that that once you start releasing them, they're out there. And then take a break and reevaluate. The season format not only gives you a chance to catch up and take a break, but it also gives you a natural break point to maybe shift. Season 2, we're going to try something new. So, if you're responding to current events or you're putting out your weekly sermon, weekly is possible. Or if it's your full-time job, go for it. But it's more work than you think. And the interest in, I'm going to hit record and talk, and people are going to listen. That motivator is going to die out very quickly.
Well, my biggest challenge has been more personal. I've only been doing this for about a year, and we've already alluded to it a little bit, but in my preparation, I always come, I have a list of questions. I think I know where, what the message I'm trying to share with our audience. And it's been a challenge for me to let the conversation take its own course. Just let it evolve. If I need to put my questions aside, put them aside and just see where it goes. Those always end up better than I know. When I was first starting out, the conversation was all over the place because I was just going down through my questions. So I really have had to learn to just relax and let it be a conversation like, normally, just meeting with a friend, sitting there and talking, and that always ends up with a better episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of my early podcasts, it sounded like I was doing one of those teen beat questionnaires. Like, okay, you answered that. Here's the next question. And it has no relation to what you just said. So yes, Crystal, that's the fact that you caught that within your first year shows that you're an excellent communicator.
So what other surprising things maybe have you learned? Not necessarily challenges, but just insights that you've gained through your experiences, like Crystal shared, about what really makes it turn out better than your average podcast.
I think for me, there's 2 personas that you can be as a host. You can either be a proxy for the listener. And so your curiosity and you even though all of us prepare for our interviews, try to think through, what does someone who hasn't prepared for this interview, what are they going to want to know or ask based on the answer? And then the second persona is kind of the curator of, I know what my audience wants, and here's someone that can answer their questions. I'm going to bring them together. And those sound very similar because you're still just trying to serve the audience. But just, try to decide, are you there to connect 2 people? Or are you there to be the proxy for the audience? And again, it's focused on serving the audience. That's and 2, this is separate, but I am surprised because I'm constantly connected with people at United Methodist Communications to interview. The amount of resources that this agency offers that churches need to know about and need to take advantage of. And it's not just videos, it's not just blog posts, it's not just podcasts. Like, people like Ryan, people like Crystal, you can actually get in contact with us. You can talk to people who know what they're doing, and not just me who brings on, you can bypass me, talk to the actual expert on Vacation Bible School, talk to the actual expert on social media. These people are available to you, and you can ask them questions. So I've loved learning about all the resources we make available.
We do have our local church services team who have plenty of resources that you can connect with them through our website. And speaking of resources, what are some things that churches should do to get started? Let's say that they're inspired through this conversation to give it a try. What do they do next?
I think I would say identify who your audience is. This really builds on what we've already brought up. Know your why for why you're doing it, and then seek to build out a plan that really offers some value to that audience. So, and that goes back to sort of the decentralization of the self, right? Bring it off yourself and what you want to present, and really focus on who you want to have listening, and then what you can offer them.
I would say check out a podcast like Crystal's. She is doing for the denomination what a local church could do for their community. They can interview people in the community from within their congregation, leaders in other churches, or just community leaders, and learn their story and distill from that either a key takeaway or a spiritual practice that we can apply in that area. I think, both Ryan and I's podcasts tend to serve the leaders, and Crystal's does that as well. But I think Crystal's is an excellent template that churches can steal and implement locally. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Dan, since you're doing a church marketing podcast, what's the importance of marketing to your audience? It's come up a couple of times that, if you're just putting things out on the airwaves but no one's listening, then it doesn't really help. So how do you, once you've got all the technical stuff in place and who your audience is, how do you get some listeners?
That's a great question. And if I figured that out, we'd be on the top of the charts. It's hard. It's just really hard. A lot of it is, especially in the beginning, it's just mouth to mouth. Like you can post about it on social media and that's great, but someone's not generally scrolling Facebook is not going to stop and listen to even a 15-minute podcast episode. So maybe getting clips and creating a little video or an audio clip that people can share, or it's just recruiting people right from the beginning. Like I said, I prefer the season format, but even still, launch with 2 or 3 episodes that are available immediately and directly invite people to listen. Make sure there are 2 or 3 of your strongest episodes. Don't start with I don't really know what I'm doing. Welcome to my podcast. We're going to figure it out as we go along. Like, start with your strongest interviews. It doesn't have to be the first one you did. That's another benefit to batching them, is get them all recorded. Start with your strongest. And the thing marketing guru Seth Godin talks about is people don't share to make you feel better. They share to make themselves feel better. So why would they want to share about it? What do they gain by sharing it? And so hopefully with our podcast, if a church communicator or a pastor shares it with another pastor, they then get oh, wow, you shared with me something that was actually helpful. So that's, again, getting in your audience's shoes. It's not just how to serve them, but how does what you create, how is it something that they actually want to share with other people?
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all my guests today for this International Podcast Day edition of the Digital Lounge. I hope that our audience has learned something, or maybe gotten some inspiration that might make them want to look into this a little further. You can find these podcasts and more at umc.org/podcast, PODCASTS. And then through those links, you can find like some of the older episodes and look at some of the topics that our hosts here have been talking about today. And be sure to check out resourceumc.org/communications for other resources that are available to you. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Happy Podcast Day.
Thanks, everyone.